Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel. We do 2 streams a week. This is the first one of the week on Tuesday nights, and it is about reading old folklore and fairy tales. It's a good kind of chill stream. There'll be a little bit of sound effects in the background, a little bit of drama from me, but for the most part, I'm reading old folklore. In the case of tonight, Celtic folklore. And I'll say a bit more about that a little later. On Thursdays also we do a write-along stream, which is a lot more contemporary and more for people who like kind of playing games and so on, stuff like that. It's about writing more so than reading. And you're welcome to join us. It's Thursday, 6:30 Pacific for that one. That's called The Varietal Show. But tonight is Fireside Fairytales. The fire is going, which means that I need to tell you about what we're doing tonight. We're doing 2 stories tonight, and they are tied together by 2 things. The first thing is they both come from the book Celtic Fairytales by Joseph Jacobs, which is an older book. Joseph Jacobs was a translator from the turn of the century. He translated lots of different cultures' works, but he himself focused on English folklore, although tonight we will be looking at Celtic, which obviously they have a lot of relations, if geographic, if nothing else, but they are quite distinct. The second thing that ties these together is what the stream's titles are about, whether it's the icon or the title, which is this is about Fae or Fairy or the little people or the good people. There's a few names for them that kidnap people. Usually for nefarious purposes, although it's always left implied what exactly their plans are. And so I'm going to say a bit more on that. But if you are a person, I'm going to turn the music down just a touch. If you are a person who does not want any context, you already know about Celtic, you don't want to hear about, sort of a frame on the stories tonight, check down in the description below. If it's not live, obviously for me, I'm live right now, but if you're not watching this live, down in the description below, there will be timestamps, little numbers in a time code that you can click on to jump to one of the 2 stories we're reading tonight. The first one we're reading tonight, by the way, is called Connla and the Fairy Maiden, which is a shorter tale about a young man enchanted by the Fae. And the second tale is called Guleesh, which is a much longer tale that will take us through to the end of the show. And it is about the Fae kind of tricking some people into kidnapping. Because again, that is the theme tonight. And it touches on some themes we've looked at actually on the show before. But so anyways, point is, if you don't want any of this, click on the timestamps below. So a couple of things quickly. I've said it before, but I will repeat it in case this is your first stream you're watching. Celtic is a sort of broad category of areas in modern day. Celtic can include everything from Cornwall in southern England to Ireland to Scotland. I think Welsh even falls into the Celtic catchment, but if I'm wrong about that, someone will certainly let me know. But Celtic, I won't go into the full history. You can clearly, look on wonderful videos about it online from proper historians, which I am not. But just so you understand, Celtic covers a broad category of people that used to be a more cohesive group in thousands of years ago. Like, they've been around for a long time. As a result, Celtic tales from Joseph Jacobs kind of cross a lot of different boundaries, although for the most part, I will say Joseph Jacobs seems to take Irish tales. The ones tonight, I think they're Irish, but it's hard to say. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that the little folk, the good people, the little people, the Fae, the spirits, the blah, 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 piskies if you're in Cornwall, leprechauns and from Ireland, and a whole bunch of other things. There's like 30,000 different names for what could be. They, in one of their stories, they're called Sheehog, and it's spelt as it's pronounced in the story, but it's spelt differently in Irish. They are just sort of mischievous little spirits. And when I say fae or fairies in this context of this stream, well, that is a diverse thing. You know, it's not consistent from story to story. That's what I mean. Little fae folk that have hard to, or I should say, inscrutable purposes, but can are prone to making deals. And yeah, I won't say more than that. They're sort of chaos. But the idea that they're good or they're bad is not a frame you should bring to it. I will say that. And so what we're going to look at today is something that really comes up in Celtic lore around Fae. It does come up in other things. It comes up in Norwegian lore and so on, but not as prevalently, which is the Fae often try to kidnap people. There's a lot of stories I've found, horror stories and otherwise, from sort of Celtic traditions where they try to kidnap people and often succeed. So we're going to see some stories. In one of these tales, it's a very ominous outcome. And in one of them, it's a more cheerful outcome. So I hopefully straddle the two options. And with all that said, let's get to the stories, because we have longer stories tonight, and there's a good chance we'll go longer than an hour. Let me get a drink of water, and we'll move on into our stories. And we'll give ourselves some wind. I'll take the fireplace down a bit. Not that much wind. Maybe even some rain. Less wind. There we go. Okay. Our first story is Connla and the Fairy Maiden, and it comes to us from a collection of translated folktales by Joseph Jacobs, a turn-of-the-century translator, called Celtic Fairytales. And if you want to read this book yourself, you can find it for free on Gutenberg.org, in digital formats, of course. Connla of the Fiery Hair was the son of Conn of the 100 Fights. And one day, as he stood by the side of his father at the height of Usna, he saw a maiden clad in strange attire coming towards him. "Whence comest thou, maiden?" said Connla. "I come from the plains of the ever-living," she said, "and there, where there is neither death nor sin, there we keep holiday away. Nor need we help from any in our joy, and in all pleasure we have no strife. And because we have our homes in the round green hills, men call us the hill folk." Well, the king and all with him wondered to hear such a voice, when they saw no one. For save Connla alone, none saw that fairy maiden, but they heard it. "To whom art thou talking, my son?" said Conn the king. Then the maiden answered, "Connla speaks to a young fair maid, whom neither death nor old age awaits. I love Connla, and now I call him away to the plain of pleasure. Moy Mel, where Borag is king for aye, nor has there been complaint or sorrow in that land since he has held the kingship. Oh, come with me, Connla of the fiery hair, ruddy as the dawn with thy tawny skin. A fairy crown awaits thee to grace thy comely face and royal form. Come, and never shall thy comeliness fade, nor thy youth, till the last awful day of judgment." Just as a note, a bodag is like an old male hag. Like a hag would be sort of an evil witch, I guess. You can look it up. You can see pictures of them. They're a big thing in Celtic lore. The king, in fear at what the maiden said, which he heard though he could not see her, called aloud to his druid, Coran by name. "O Coran of the many spells," he said, "and of the cunning magic, I call upon thy aid. A task is upon me too great for all my skill and wit, greater than any laid upon me since I seized the kingship. A maiden unseen has met us, and by her power would take me from my dear, my comely son. If thou help not, he will be taken from thy king by women's wiles and witchery." Then Coran, the druid, stood forth and chanted his spells towards the spot where the maiden's voice had been heard, and none heard her voice again, nor could Connla see her longer. Only as she vanished before the druid's mighty spell, she threw an apple to Connla, the boy who could see her. I know this can be a little confusing. Con is the king, who's his dad. Connla is the son, who she's charming. For a whole month from that day, Connla would take nothing, either to eat or drink, save from the apple that the fairy maiden left him. But as he ate it, it grew again, and always kept whole. And all the while there grew within him a mighty yearning, longing after the maiden he had seen. But when the day of the month of waiting came, Connla stood by the side of the king his father on the plain of Arkaman, and again he saw the maiden come towards him, and again she spoke to him. "'Tis a glorious place, forsooth, that Connla holds among short-lived mortals, awaiting the day of death. Oh, but now the folk of life, the other living ones, beg and bid thee come to Moimel, the plain, for they have learnt to know thee, seeing thee in thy home among thy dear ones." And when Con the king heard the maiden's voice, he called to his men aloud and said, "Summon swift my druid Coran, for I see she has again this day the power of speech." And then the maiden said, "O mighty Con, fighter of 100 fights, the druid's power is little loved. It has little honor in the mighty land, peopled with so many of the upright. And when the law will come, it will do away with the druid's magic spells that come from the lips of the false black demon." Then Con the king observed that since the maiden came, Connla his son spoke to none that spake to him. So Con of the 100 fights said to him, "Is it to thy mind what the woman says, my son?" "'Tis hard upon me," then said Connla. "I love my own folk above all things, but yet, a longing seizes me for the maiden." And when the maiden heard this, she answered and said, "The ocean is not so strong as the waves of thy longing. Come with me in my curragh, the gleaming, straight-gliding crystal canoe. Soon we can reach Bodag's realm. I see the bright sun sink, yet far as it is, we can reach it before the dark. There is, too, another land worthy of thy journey, a land joyous to all who seek it. Only wives and maidens dwell there, and if thou wilt, we can seek it and live there alone, together in joy." When the maiden ceased to speak, Connla of the fiery hair rushed away from them and sprang into her crystal curragh, the gleaming, straight-gliding crystal canoe. And then they all, king and court, saw it glide away over the bright sea. Towards the setting sun. Away and away till I could see it no longer, and Connla and the fairy maiden went their way on the sea, and were no more seen, nor did any know where they came. That's our first tale. That's called Connla and the Fairy Maiden. And what we see there is ominous. The story is interesting to me because it never outright states that, Connla's kind of screwed and being drawn away. But to put it in context, a common tale, especially even in Irish folklore and other Celtic folklores, a common tale is that Fae will come along and sort of one way or another attract your attention or make a deal with you or something like that. And it'll be, to take an example of one, I can't remember if it's O'Shawn, a famous Irish folklore character. And if you're not Irish, it's not spelled anyway the way you think the O'Shawn would be spelled. I think it's O'Shawn, but it might not be. I might be mixing stories. At one point meets a fae, and the fae says, come and spend 7 days in service to me and I'll give you some great thing. And so they do, by following them to the fae realm, and they discover that it's actually each day's a year in that realm. It's 7 years. And there's other versions of it that are arguably a part of the same idea, which is fae will come sometimes kind of well-intentioned and not really understanding human connections to the world because they sort of live eternally. But there's another version of it where they go to Tir na Nog, which is the Irish sort of heavenly space below lakes and lochs. But the thing about that is, like, in most stories, well, not in most stories, in some stories it can be as much as a century per day spent down there, and they don't know that ahead of time. Like, those are common sort of tropes. There is this overwhelming idea, though, and it's seeded in this story in a few places through some symbolism and so on, that the Fae are not Christian, and they can't be. And there's a bunch of interpretations as to why that is, but I'm not going to go into that. What you can assume, though, is that the inclusion of an apple here is probably a reference to the idea that he's sort of taking part in sin. And there's a reference that, you'll live happily until the day of judgment comes. And it's sort of left vague, but I think the implication is he chooses to go live this good, nearly eternal life. But then when, Jesus or whatever your tradition says, comes down from heaven and judges the whole earth, you will be judged lacking for taking up with the Fae. So I don't think anything good is coming of Con here, at least in this telling of the story. Now our next story is a slightly different equation. Same idea, but it is a slightly different equation. So I'm going to drink some water. This is a much longer story, but it is a very entertaining one, I think. Okay. Just adjusting a couple of things here. So the story that will take us through to the end of the night is called Guleesh, and comes to us also from Celtic Fairytales, which is again a collection of translations and collection by Joseph Jacobs, a turn-of-the-century translator. The book itself, Celtic Fairytales by Joseph Jacobs, you can listen or read for free from Gutenberg.org. There was once a boy in the County Mayo. Guleesh was his name. There was the finest wraith a little way off from the gable of the house, and he was often in the habit of seating himself on the fine grass bank that was running about it. Now one night he stood, half leaning against the gable of the house and looking up into the sky and watching the beautiful white moon over his head. And after he'd been standing that way for a couple of hours, he said to himself, "My bitter grief, that I am not gone away out of this place altogether. I'd sooner be any place in the world than here. Ah, it's well enough for you, white moon," says he. "That's turning round and round as you please yourself, and no man can put you back, but I wish I was the same as you." Hardly was the word out of his mouth when he heard a great noise coming, like the sound of many people running together. And they were talking, and they were laughing, and making sport, and the sound went on by him like the whirl of wind, and he was listening to it going into the rath. "Musha by my soul," says he, "but you're merry enough, and I'll follow thee." What was in it but the fairy host? Though he did not know at first that it was they who were in it, but he followed them into the rath. And it's there he heard the falperny and the folperny and the rapalea huta and the rulia bulia that they had there, and every man of them crying out as loud as they could, "My horse and bridle and saddle! My horse and bridle and saddle!" "By my hands," said Guleesh, "my boy, that's not bad. I'll imitate you." And he cried out as well, "My horse, my bridle and saddle! My horse and bridle and saddle!" And on the moment there was a fine horse with a bridle of pure gold and a saddle of shining silver standing before him. He leaped up on it to it, and the moment he was on its back, he saw clearly that the rath was full of horses and of little people going riding on them. Said a man of them to him, "Are you coming with us tonight, Guleesh?" "I'm surely," said Guleesh. "If you are, come along," said the little man, and they went all together, riding like the wind, faster than the fastest horse ever you saw hunting, and faster than the fox and the hounds at his tail. The cold winter's wind was before them. They overtook her, and the cold winter's wind that was behind them, she did not overtake them, and stop nor stay of that full race did they make none until they came to the brink of the sea. Then every one of them said, "High over cap! High over cap!" And that moment they were up in the air, and before Guleesh had time to remember where he was, they were down on dry land again, and were going like the wind. And at last they stood still, and a man of them said to Guleesh, "Guleesh, do you know where you are now?" "Not a know," says Guleesh. "You're in France, Guleesh," said he. "The daughter of the King of France is to be married tonight. The handsomest woman that the sun ever saw, and we must do our best to bring her with us, if we're only able to carry her off. And you must come with us, that we may be able to put the young girl up behind you on the horse when we'll be bringing her away. For it's not lawful for us to put her sitting behind ourselves. But you're flesh and blood, and she can take a good grip of you, so that she won't fall off the horse. Are you satisfied, Guleesh? And will you do what we're telling you?" Why shouldn't I be satisfied, said Guleesh. I'm satisfied, surely, and anything that you will tell me to do, I'll do it without doubt. So they got off their horses right then and there. And a man from them said a word that Guleesh did not understand, and on the moment they were lifted up, and Guleesh found himself and his companions in the palace. And it was there in the palace that a great feast was going on. And there was not a nobleman or gentleman in the kingdom, but was gathered there dressed in silk and satin and gold and silver. And the night was as bright as the day with all the lamps and candles that were lit. And Guleesh had to shut his 2 eyes at the brightness. When he opened them again and looked from him, he thought he never saw anything as fine as all he saw there. There were hundreds of tables spread out, and they were full of meat and drink on each of them, flesh meat and cakes and sweetmeats, and wine and ale and every drink that every man saw. The musicians were at the 2 ends of the hall, and they were playing the sweetest music that ever a man's ear heard. And there were young women and fine youths in the middle of the hall, dancing and turning and going round so quickly and so lightly that it put a suran in Guleesh's head to be looking at them. And there were more there playing tricks and making fun and laughing. For such a feast as there was that day had not been in France for 20 years. And because the old king had no children alive, but only the 1 daughter, and because she was to be married to the son of another king that night. 3 days the feast was going on, and the 3rd night she was to be married. And that was the night that Guleesh and the she-hogs, the good folk, the little men, came, hoping, if they could, to carry off the young princess, to carry them off on the back of their horse with Guleesh. Now Guleesh and his companions were standing together at the head of the hall, where there was a fine altar dressed up, and the 2 bishops behind it were waiting to marry the girl. And as soon as the right time should come, how nobody could see the she-hogs, for they said a word as they came in, and it made them all invisible, as if they had not been in at all. Now tell me, which of them is the king's daughter? Said Guleesh, when he was becoming a little used to the noise and light. Don't you see her there, away from you? Said the little man that he was talking to, the Fae folk. Guleesh looked where the little man was pointing his finger, and there he saw, the loveliest woman. He thought upon the ridge of the world. The rose and the lily were fighting together upon her face, and one could not tell which of them got the victory. Oh, her arms and her hands were like the lime, her mouth as red as strawberry when it was ripe, and her foot as small and as light as another one's hand, and her form was smooth and slender, and her hair was falling down from her head in buckles of gold. Her garments and dress were woven with gold and silver, and the bright stone that was in the ring upon her hand was shining as the sun. Just as a note here, because I think my audience would default to green when you say lime, he's talking about the chemical lime. I doubt they had limes at this point in any of the Celtic areas. Lime is quite white, if you want to see it, the chemical lime, if you want to see that. You can Google it. Guleesh was nearly blinded with all the loveliness and beauty that was in her. But when he looked again, he saw that she was crying, and there was trace of tears in her eyes. "It can't be," said Guleesh. "There's grief on her, and when everybody round her is so full of sport and merriment." "Musha, then she is grieved," said the little man next to him, "for it is against her own will she's marrying. She has no love for the husband she is to marry. The king was going to give her to him 3 years ago, when she was only 15, but she said she was too young and requested him to leave her as she was. Yet the king gave her a year's grace, and when that year was up, he gave her another year's grace, and then another. But a week or a day he would not give her longer, for she is 18 years old tonight, and it's time for her to marry. But indeed," says he, and his crooked mouth in an ugly way, "indeed, it's no king's son she'll marry if I can help it." Guleesh pitied the handsome young lady greatly when he heard that, and he was heartbroken to think that it would be necessary for her to marry a man that she did not like, or what was worse, to take a nasty she-hog for a husband. Again, that's the little folk he's talking to. However, he did not say a word, though he could not help giving many a curse to the ill luck that was laid out for himself, to be helping the people that were to snatch her away from her home and her father. He began thinking then what it was he ought to do to save her, but he couldn't think of anything. "Oh, if I could only give her some help and relief," said he, "I wouldn't care whether I was alive or dead. But I see nothing that I can do for her." He was looking on when the king's son came up to her and asked her for a kiss, but she turned her head away from him. Guleesh had double pity for her then, when he saw the lad taking her by the soft white hand and drawing her out to dance. They went round and round in the dance near where Guleesh was, and he could plainly see there were tears in her eyes. Oh, when the dancing was over, the old king, her father, and her mother, the queen, came up and said it was the right time to marry her, and that the bishop was ready, and it was time to put the wedding ring on her and give her to her husband. So the king took the youth by the hand, and the queen took her daughter, and they went up together to the altar with the lords and great people following them. Pardon me, I need a drink of water. And they went up together to the altar, with the lords and great people following them. And when they came near the altar, there were no more than about 4 yards from it, and the little she-hog stretched out his foot right before the girl's step, and over it she fell. And before she was able to rise again, that same little she-hog threw something that was in his hand upon her, and said a couple of words. And upon the moment the maiden was gone from amongst them. Nobody could see her, for that word made her invisible. The little man then seized her and raised her up behind Guleesh on his horse. And the king nor no one else saw them, but out with them through the hall they came to the door. Ordo, dear Mary, it's there the pity was, and the trouble and the crying and the wonder and the searching and the rockon. And then that lady disappeared from their eyes, and without their seeing what it did, out of the door of the palace they went. Without being stopped or hindered, for nobody could see them. And, "My horse, my bridle and saddle," said every man of them. "My horse, my bridle and saddle," said Guleesh. And on the moment the horse was standing ready, caparisoned caparisoned before him. Now jump up, Guleesh, said the little man. Put the lady behind you and we'll be going. The morning is not far off from us now. And so Guleesh raised her up on the horse's back and leaped up himself before her. And rise, horse, said he. And his horse and the other horses with him went in full race until they came to the sea. High over cap, said every man of them. High over cap, said Guleesh. And on the moment the horse rose under him and cut a leap in the clouds and came down in Arran, which is a location. I know it's mostly a name now. They did not stop there, though, but went off to race to the place where Guleesh's house and the Rath. Where was his house and the Rath? And when they came as far as that, Guleesh turned and caught the young girl in his 2 arms. He leaped off the horse, and then he said, I call and cross you to myself in the name of God, said he to the young lady in his arms. And on the spot, before the word was out of his mouth, the horse fell down. And what was it but a beam of a plough now, and of which they, the Fae, had made it into a horse, and every other horse they had in their riding party. It was that way they made it. So some were now riding an old besom, and some were on a broken stick, and more on a bowlawn and a hemlock stalk. The good people called out together when they heard what Guleesh said. Oh, Guleesh, you clown, you thief! That no good may happen to you. Why did you play that trick on us? But they had no power at all to carry off the grid. Pardon me, the girl. After Guleesh had consecrated the young lady to himself. Oh, Guleesh, isn't that a nice turn you did for us? And we so kind to you. What good have we now that out of our journey to France? Never mind yet, you clown. You'll pay another time for this. Believe us, you'll repent it. He'll have no good to get out of the young girl, said the little man that was talking to him in the palace before that, and as he said the word, he moved over and struck her a slap to the side of the head. Now, says he, she'll be without talk any more. Now, Guleesh, what good will she be to you when she'll be dumb? It's time for us to go, but you'll remember us, Guleesh. By the way, dumb, this is the old world version of dumb, which was sort of mute. Can't speak. When he said that, he stretched out his 2 hands before Guleesh was able to give an answer. He and the rest of them were gone into the Rath, out of his sight, and he saw them no more. Well, he turned to the young woman and he said to her, Thanks be to God, they're gone. Would you not sooner stay with me than with him? But she gave him no answer. There's trouble and grief on her yet, said Guleesh in his own mind, and he spoke to her again. I am afraid you must spend this night in my father's house, lady. And if there's anything I can do for you, tell me and I'll be your servant. Well, the beautiful girl, she yet remained silent, but there were tears in her eyes, and her face was white and red after each other. Lady, said Guleesh, tell me what you'd like to do now. I never belonged at all to that lot of she-hogs who carried you away with them. I am the son of an honest farmer. I went with them without knowing it. If I'll be able to send you back to your father, I'll do it, and I pray you make any use of me now that you may wish. And he looked into her face, and he saw her mouth move, as if she was going to speak. But no word came from it. It cannot be, said Guleesh, that you are dumb. Did I not hear you speaking to the king's son in the palace tonight? Or has that devil made you really dumb, where he struck his nasty hand on your jaw? And the girl raised her white, smooth hand and laid her finger on her tongue to show him that she had lost her voice and the power of speech, and the tears ran out of her eyes like streams. And Guleesh's own eyes were not dry, for as rough as he was on the outside, he had but a soft heart, and he could not stand the sight of the young girl, and she in that unhappy plight. So he began thinking with himself what he ought to do, and he did not like to bring her home with himself to his father's house, for he knew well that they would not believe him, that he had been in France and brought back with him the King of France's daughter, and he was afraid they might make a mock of the young lady or insult her. As he was doubting what he ought to do and hesitating, he chanced to remember the priest. "Glory be to God," said he. "I know what I'll do. I'll bring her to the priest's house, and he won't refuse me to keep the lady in care for her." And he turned to the lady again and told her that he was loth to take her to his father's house, but that there was an excellent priest, very friendly to himself, who would take good care of her, and if she wished to remain in his house, if she wished to remain in the priest's house, but that if there was any other place she'd rather go, he said he would bring her to it. Well, she bent her head to show him she was obliged, and gave him to understand that she was ready to follow him any place he was going. "Okay, we will go to the priest's house then," said he. "He's under an obligation to me, and will do anything I ask him." So they went together accordingly to the priest's house, and the sun was just rising when they came to the door, and so Guleesh beat it hard. And as early as it was, the priest was up and opened the door himself, and he wondered when he saw Guleesh and the girl, for he was certain that it was coming wanting to be married they were. I do not understand the structure of that sentence when I read it the first time, and I still don't. Guleesh, isn't it a nice boy you are, that you can't wait till 10 o'clock or 12? But that you must be coming to me at this hour looking for marriage, you and your sweetheart. You ought to know that I can't marry you at such time, or at all events, can't marry you lawfully. Said he, and suddenly as he looked again at the young girl, "In the name of God, who have you here? Who is she? How did you get her?" "Father," said Guleesh, "you can marry me or anybody else if you wish, but it's not looking for marriage I came to you now, but to ask you, if you please, to give a lodging in your house to this young lady." Well, the priest looked at him as though he had 10 heads on him, but without putting any other question to him, he desired to come in, himself and the maiden. And when they came in, he shut the door and brought them into the parlor and put them sitting. "Now, Guleesh," said he, "tell me truly, who is this young lady, and whether you're out of your senses really, or only making a joke of me?" Said the priest. "I'm not telling a word of lie, nor making a joke of you," said Guleesh. "But it was from the palace of the King of France I carried off this lady, for she is the daughter of the King of France." He began his story then, and he told the whole of it to the priest, and the priest was so much surprised that he could not help calling out at times, or clapping his hands together. And when Guleesh said from what he saw, he thought the girl was not satisfied with the marriage that was going to take place in the palace before he and the she-hogs broke it up, there came a red blush into the girl's cheek. And he was more certain than ever that she had sooner be as she was, badly as she was, than be the married wife of the man she hated. And when Guleesh said that he would be very thankful to the priest if he would keep her in his house, the kind man said he would do that as long as Guleesh pleased, but that he did not know what they ought to do with her, because they had no means of sending her back to her father again. Guleesh answered that he was uneasy about the same thing, that he saw nothing to do but keep quiet until they should find some opportunity of doing something better. They made it up then between themselves that the priest should let on that it was the brother's daughter he had, who was come to visit him from another county, and that he should tell everybody that she was dumb and do his best to keep everyone away from her. They told the young girl what it was they intended to do, and she showed by her eyes that she was obliged to them. Guleesh went home then, and when his people asked him where he'd been, he said that he had been asleep at the foot of a ditch and had passed the night there. In other words, he was drunk. There was great wonderment on the priest's neighbors at the girl who came so suddenly to his house without anyone knowing where she was from or what business she had there, and some of the people said that everything was not as it ought to be, and others that Guleesh was not like the same man that was in it before, and that it was a great story how he was drawing every day to the priest's house, and that the priest had a wish and a respect for him, a thing they could not clear up at all. That was true for them indeed, for it was seldom the day went by but Guleesh would go to the priest's house and have a talk with him. And as often as he would come, he used to hope to find the young lady well again, with leave to speak, but alas, she remained dumb and silent, without relief or cure. And since she had no other means of talking, she carried on a sort of conversation between herself and himself by moving her hands and fingers, and winking her eyes, and opening and shouting her mouth, and laughing or smiling, and 1,000 other signs, so that it was not long until they understood each other very well. Guleesh was always thinking how he could send her back to her father, but there was no one to go with her, and he himself did not know even what road to go, for he'd never been out of his own country before the night he brought her away with him. Nor had the priest any better knowledge than he, but when Guleesh asked him, he wrote 3 or 4 letters to the King of France and gave them to buyers and sellers of wares, who used to be going from place to place across the street, but they all went astray, and never a one came to the king's hand. This was the way that they were for many months, and Guleesh was falling deeper and deeper in love with her every day. And it was plain to himself and the priest that she at least liked him back. The boy feared greatly at last lest the king should really hear where his daughter was and take her back from himself, and he besought the priest to write no more, but to leave the matter to God. So they passed the time for a year, until there came a day when Guleesh was lying by himself on the grass, and on the last day of the last month in autumn, he was thinking over and over again in his own mind of everything that happened to him from the day that he went with those she-hogs across the sea, and he remembered then suddenly that it was one November night that he was standing at the gable of the house when that whirlwind occurred, and the she-hogs came in it. And so he said to himself, "We have a November night again today. I'll stand in the same place I was last year until I see if the good people come again. Perhaps I might see or hear something that would be useful to me, that might bring her to talk again to Mary. Bring back her talk again to Mary." And that was the name himself and the priest called the king's daughter, for neither of them knew her right name. He told his intention to the priest, and the priest gave him his blessing. Well, Guleesh accordingly went to the old rath when the night was darkening, and he stood with his bent elbow leaning on a grey old flag, waiting till the middle of the night should come. And the moon rose slowly, and it was like a knob of fire behind him, and there was a white fog which was raised up over the fields of grass, and it dampens all places. And through the coolness of the night, after a great heat in the day, the night was calm as is a lake when there is not a breath of wind to move a wave on it. And there was no sound to be heard but the crowing of insects that would go by from time to time, or the hoarse sudden cry of the wild geese as they passed from lake to lake, half a mile up in the air over his head, or the sharp whistle of the golden and green plover rising and lying and lying and rising as they do on calm night. And there were 1,000 bright stars shining overhead. And there was indeed a little frost out, which left the grass under his foot white and crisp. So he stood there for an hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours, and the frost increased greatly, so that he heard the breaking of the traneens under his foot as he moved. He was thinking in his own mind at last that the she-hogs would not come that night, and that it was as good for him to return back again, when he heard a sound far away from him, coming towards him. And he recognized what it was at the first moment. The sound increased, and at first it was like the beating of waves on the stony shore, but then it was like the falling of a great waterfall. And at last it was like a loud storm in the top of the trees. And then the whirlwind burst into the wrath of one rout, and the she-hogs were in it. And it all went by him so suddenly that he lost his breath with it. But he came to himself on the spot and put an ear on himself, listening to what they would say. Scarcely had they gathered into the wrath till they all began shouting and screaming and talking amongst themselves, and then each one of them cried out, "My horse and bridle and saddle, my horse and bridle and saddle." And Guleesh took courage and called out as loudly as any of them, "My horse, my bridle and saddle, my horse and bridle and saddle." But before the word was well out of his mouth, another man cried out, "Ora, Guleesh, my boy, are you here with us again? How are you getting on with your woman? There's no use in your calling for your horse tonight. I'll go bail you won't play such a trick on us again. It was a good trick you played on us last year." "It was," said another man from the crowd. "He won't do it again." "Isn't he a prime lad? The same lad to take a woman that never said as much to him as, 'How do you do?' since this time last year," said a third man. "Perhaps it'd be like to be looking at her," said another voice. "And if the Almadon only knew that there's an herb growing up his own door, and if he were to boil it and give it to her, she'd be well," said another voice. Almadon means fool. "That's true for you. He is an Almadon. Don't bother your head with him. We'll be going. We'll leave the Borak as he is." Again, kind of another term for being a bit of a fool. And with that, they rose up into the air, and out with them one Rooya, Booya, the way they came, and they left the poor Guleesh standing there where they found him, and the two eyes going out of his head, looking after them, and now wondering about what he'd heard. He did not stand long until he returned back, and he, thinking in his own mind on all he saw and heard, wondering whether there was really an herb at this own door, and that would bring back the talk to the king's daughter. "It can't be," says he to himself, "that they would tell it to me, if there was any virtue in it. But perhaps the she-hog didn't observe himself when he let the word slip out of his mouth. I'll search well, as soon as the sun rises, whether there's any plant growing beside the house except thistles and dockings." And so he went home, and as tired as he was, he did not sleep a wink until the sun rose on the morrow. He got up then, and it was the first thing he did to go out and search well through the grass round the house. Trying, could he get any herb that he did not recognize? And indeed, it was not long searching till he observed a large strange herb that was growing up just by the gable of the house. And so he went over it and observed it closely. And he saw that there were 7 little branches coming out of the stalk, and 7 leaves growing on every branch between them. 7 is an important number here. It is debatable why it gets used, but I will say that one use of 7 is to be a holy number. I know 3 is usually, but for whatever reason, 7 also has that association. But it could be something else being referenced here. "It's very wonderful," said he to himself, "that I never noticed this herb before. If there's any virtue in a herb at all, it ought to be such a strange one as this." And so he drew out his knife, cut the plant, and carried it into his own house. And he stripped the leaves off and cut up the stalk, and from it came a white, thick juice. And as there comes out of the sow thistle when it is bruised, except that this juice was more like an oil. He put it in a little pot with a little water in it and laid it on the fire until the water was boiling. And then he took a cup, filled it half up with juice, and put it to his own mouth. And it came into his head then that perhaps it was poison that was in it, and that the good people were only tempting him, that he might kill himself with this trick, or even put the girl to death without meaning it. It certainly is a thing Fae would do. So he put the cup down again. He raised a couple of drops to his finger and put it to his mouth. Well, it was not bitter. Indeed, it had a sweet, agreeable taste. He grew bolder then and drank the full thimble of it, and then as much again. And he never stopped till he had half the cup drunk. Well, he fell asleep after that and did not wake until it was night. And then there was a great hunger and thirst upon him. He had to wait then till the day arose, but he determined as soon as he should wake in the morning that he should go to the king's daughter and give her a drink of the juice of the herb. And as soon as he got up in the morning and went over to the priest's house with the drink in hand, and he never felt himself so bold and valiant and spirited and light as he did as he was on that day. For it was quite certain that it was the drink he drank which made him so hardy. And so when he came into the house, he found the priest and the young lady sitting young lady within. And they were wondering greatly why he had not visited them for 2 whole days. He then excitedly told them all his news, and said that he was certain that there was great power in that herb, and that it would do the lady no hurt, for he tried it himself and got good from it. And then he made her taste it, for he vowed and swore that there was no harm in it. Guleesh handed her the cup, and she drank half of it, and then fell back on her bed, and a heavy sleep came on her, and she never woke out of that sleep till the day on the morrow. Guleesh and the priest sat up the entire night with her, waiting till she should awake, and they were between hope and unhope, between expectation of saving her and fear of hurting her. She awoke at last when the sun had gone half its way through the heavens. She rubbed her eyes and looked like a person who did not know where she was. She was like one astonished when she saw Guleesh and the priest in the same room with her, and she sat up doing her best to collect her thoughts. The 2 men were in great anxiety, waiting to see, would she speak or would she not speak? And when they remained silent for a couple of minutes, the priest said to her, "Did you sleep well, Mary?" And she answered him, "I slept, merci." No sooner did Guleesh hear her talking than he put a shout of joy out of him and ran over to her and fell on his 2 knees and said, "1,000 thanks to God, who has given you back the talk. Lady of my heart, speak again to me." And the lady answered him that she understood it was he who boiled that drink for her and gave it to her, and that she was obliged to him from her heart for all the kindness he'd shown her since the day she first came to Ireland, and that she might be certain that she never would forget it. Guleesh was ready to die with satisfaction and delight, and then they brought her food, and she ate with a good appetite and was merry and joyous, and never left off talking with the priest while she was eating. And after Guleesh went home to his house and stretched out himself on the bed and fell asleep again, for the force of the herb was not all spent, and he passed another day and night sleeping, when he awoke up, he went back to the priest's house and found that the young lady was in the same state, and that she was asleep almost since the time he'd left the house. He went into her chamber with the priest, and they remained watching beside her till she awoke the second time. And she had her talk as well as ever, and Guleesh was greatly rejoiced. The priest put food on the table again, and they ate together. And Guleesh used after that to come to the house from day to day, and the friendship that was between them and the king's daughter increased, because she had no one to speak to except Guleesh and the priest, and she liked Guleesh the best. So they married one another. And that was the fine wedding they had. And if I were to be there then, I would not be here now, in my place with no air conditioning. But I heard it from a birding that there was neither cark nor care, sickness nor sorrow, mishap nor misfortune on them till the hour of their death. And may the same be with you, with me, well, with us all. GS says, good evening. Not speaking is not the end of the world. Yeah. She only gets one line in the whole story. Okay, I'll turn the music back on. And we will... GS says, oh my, that's a surprisingly good ending. Yeah, it's the first one had a less cheerful ending, but this one had the more cheerful ending. It is also the much longer story. It took us close to 40 minutes to read. But I really enjoyed it. Again, these tales were from Celtic Fairytales, which is from Joseph Jacobs, a turn-of-the-century translator and collector of folklore, primarily English, but in this case Celtic. And it's a book that you can get from Gutenberg.org for free if you want to read the rest of the stories yourself. I have read from this book before. I read from it a couple of weeks ago, and I read from before then like a year ago, maybe more. But yeah, I've read some of these stories before. So yeah, the point of tonight was just to go through this sort of trend in Celtic folklore that had the where fairies kind of trick you to come along and steal women. And it's not uncommon in these stories. Actually, the version of this story is a much more elaborated and longer version of a sort of a version of a tale that we read before, which I believe, if my memory serves, was Cornish. And in that version of the story, the young man is told not to bother a sort of abandoned castle that the Fae party in. And he does. And they are like, yeah, come on, party with us. And they ride across, I believe it's either Cornwall or Ireland or something, but I think it's Cornwall. And they go to a city, and there's just a woman there that they steal. And he, in the same way, feels bad about it. He realizes he's gotten himself into something he shouldn't be in. And again, this is a story we've read before. And they have to keep her, he sort of steals her back. They get mad and put the curse of dumbness on her, and him and his grandmother have to keep her for a year. I don't actually remember how that one resolves. I know she gets her voice back, but I don't remember how it resolves. I know that they have to, after getting the voice back, ride back to town where her father is, and he's wealthy, and they live happily ever after. But in the case of these ones, we see a mixture of outcomes. I am actually a little surprised. I do wonder if there's some editing done by Joseph Jacobs here on the story, that the young man never sees a consequence for tricking the Fae. Because it is a lot more likely that even if the girl gets out of it, you see a consequence for tricking the Fae. At some point, you make a mistake. Because they're very tricksy folk, and a lot of the point of the story is to avoid the Fae as much as possible. But yeah, and there was another story we read from the Irish Tales of Peasantry, the Irish Folk and Fairy Tales. Sorry, the Folk and Fairy Tales of Irish Peasantry, which is W.B. Yeats' book from the turn of the century, collection of Irish translations that we've read from several times. I wouldn't know what video to direct you to find this one, but I think it's the one about leprechauns, because I think it's a leprechaun that takes a man with him and he's sort of partying and drinking, and then they go to a wedding and there's a woman there, and the leprechaun wants to get the woman in a sack, and the young man foils the leprechaun, as I recall. GS says, excellent acting tonight, Rory. I was completely engaged. Thank you very much, GS. I wouldn't have known what to do either. Were the Fae tricking him, or did one slip up? I think it's implied that one slipped up, right? Whatever, for whatever reason. I mean, just the convenience of the plot. Anyways, thank you very much, folks, for coming along and listening to my tales tonight. If you like this video, please remember to give it a like. It's like a little round of applause. It's the only feedback I actually get from YouTube. The rest is just me staring at a camera. I know that doesn't feel that, you don't feel that from your end, but it is hard to know what people like, and so liking is a way of telling me that. And if you did enjoy this, we have a whole playlist of old folklore, fairy tales, even some horror tales, and Arthur Conan Doyle, and Lovecraft, and folks like that, kind of tales that we usually tell in the month of October, but you can find in that collection as well, of me telling tales to you. Some have sound effects, some are just me reading. The older ones, I hadn't figured myself out as much. But yeah, consider subscribing if you haven't already. And yeah, I hope that I won't say anything more. I guess I'll keep the fire warm for you. I hope you have a good sleep. Good night.